Sure, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Felicia Fuller, and I will be one of the moderators for today's webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few of the basics for today's webinar. To limit the background noise, all attendees have been muted. As we go through today's webinar, please feel free to send any questions you may have through the questions panel, which should be located either on the right-hand side of your screen or towards the bottom of your screen. We will also have a short Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. We will try to answer as many questions as possible given the time that we have left. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will respond to them via email. Thank you again for signing up for GBRI's free webinar. We have had over 1,200 registrants. While waiting for all of them, GBRI is an online sustainability education provider founded with the belief that the best way to encourage responsible development is to provide resources to builders, designers, and engineers who are crafting our future. And I see some people are saying they are still having audio issues. We will share an alternate link for you to join in the chat. So if you want to look in the chat, we will share an alternate link for you to join.
Let's give a couple more minutes. Is it Ashley? Can anyone in the audience let us know? Are you still having issues hearing us, or? Okay, so I see some folks saying I can hear, no problem. Okay, all right. Thank you for letting us know. Perfect. Good to go. Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Joseph, Amy, Nancy. Thank you so much. All right. Yes, Felicia.
All right, let's go ahead and continue. Then we go to the next slide, Justin. At GBRI, our mission is to make sustainability resources affordable and accessible to everyone across the globe. With the mission in our mind, we have introduced webinars with suggested pricing where one can access it for free if they are facing hardship or watching it to enhance their knowledge. Other than hundreds of courses geared towards sustainability, we have best-in-class exam prep for the LEED Green Associate, LEED AP, and WELL AP exams. Don't let the pandemic keep you away from where you want to be. GBRI has introduced a unique scholarship program for students and sustainability professionals from around the world. This is one of our ways to be part of the solution. To expedite the process, there is no application process like there normally would be. Instead, GBRI encourages interested applicants to use the honor system. On this page, we have listed a few scholarship codes that applicants can use when registering for their CE or exam prep courses. Depending on the code applicants enter, the shopping cart will automatically reduce the out-of-pocket costs by 30 to 100%. At this time, users can get up to 50% off CE packages and up to 100% off all exam prep packages. This scholarship is GBRI's way of thanking you and recognizing your perseverance in the face of adversity. We hope this token of love and support will help you stay on the track with the important work you do despite the disruptions. Okay, so in case you missed last month's webinar, we looked at HVAC operation strategies to help mitigate the transmission of respiratory infections such as COVID-19. It is now available on demand, and I will share the link to that on-demand webinar in the chat right now. Today's webinar has been approved for 1.5 lead and well general hours and 1.5 AIA HSW LUs. It may also count for CE credit with other organizations. However, you would need to check with that organization directly. Since today's webinar is live, you will not need to complete a quiz. You will earn your CE credit for participating in at least half of today's webinar. Within 72 hours, you should have received your certificate of completion as well as see the hours earned for your webinar on your CE transcripts. Now let's get started. Climate Change and Health, a lunchtime chat with Dr. Joan Schiller and Craig Schiller. Jeslyn Vargas is GBRI's President and Director of Sustainability, and he will be joining me as today's moderator for the webinar. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jeslyn. He is once again actively teaching with GBRI, and so I would now like to welcome Jeslyn.
Thank you, Felicia. So we have right now 332 attendees. I'm going to actually get started, but if you guys continue to have issues, please use the Chrome browser, and also I think we have sent the direct link. Thank you again for joining our climate change webinar. I am very excited about the webinar today. I happened to hear Joan's webinar a few months ago when she was presenting at another event. And I reached out to her, and it also turned out that I already knew her son, Craig Schiller. So we will hear from both of them today. Craig actually has been with GBRI in the last, we have had many courses with him. Some of you may be already familiar with Craig. So climate change doesn't need an introduction. Natural calamities are commonplace in too many countries, and it is no secret that climate change is warming the air, raising sea levels, and causing more severe storms and wildfires. Air pollution alone is the world's single largest environmental health risk, with around 7 million people dying every year from exposure to polluted air. But did we know that it's also affecting human health? Climate change, by increasing disease, causing food insecurity, and disrupting medical care. Dr. Joan Schiller is a medical oncologist and adjunct professor at the University of Virginia. She is passionate about the impact of climate change on health. She recently published 2 articles, which she will mention during our webinar today. So join us. I'm very excited again to have her and Craig talk about climate change and what we can all do. On the screen, you are looking at the course objectives. Through this course, we will understand what climate change is, identify the consequences of climate change, analyze the impact of climate change on human health, and then recognize the positive response to fight climate change. And finally, we'll all learn what actions you and I can take to mitigate the health effects of climate change. As Felicia mentioned, this is an interactive webinar. We encourage you to enter your questions throughout, and I will take the questions. I will pass it on to Craig and Joan to answer them towards the end. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Craig Schiller. Some of you may already know him, as he had taught several courses with us in the past, including net zero buildings, green design for schools, etc. Craig has over 10 years of unique experience as a climate and green building deep generalist. He worked in a variety of roles to advance sustainability and decarbonize our economy, including being green building educator, designing state and federal climate policy, and managing projects in the energy efficiency, higher education, transportation, industrial, aviation, and building sectors. Welcome, Craig, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Jeslyn. And let's just go back one slide quick, if you don't mind. Great, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the introduction, Jeslyn. I won't spend too much longer talking here. I just wanted to frame this. One thing that I'm really excited about is this change in narrative that we're having now as a society. You know, for those of us who have spent our careers working in climate change, myself over the last 10 years, we've often talked about it as a problem of what we need to do. And frankly, that movement started from a fairly tree hugger environmentalist perspective. And then it moved into how can we solve this, and technologically, what do we need to do? And now we're at a point where it's become so rampant, we're having a different perspective, and that is hopefully one that is much more broad, and that is how it's affecting us and why we really need to take urgent action, not from the environmentalist perspective where this started, but from a people perspective. So as Jeslyn mentioned, I have been working in the climate change sector for the last 10 years. I'll be on this presentation a couple times throughout from a climate perspective. I do have a background in buildings. This picture is me working on a net zero energy building for Rocky Mountain Institute. It was our flagship demonstration project, one of the most energy efficient buildings in the world. And you know, I literally started working from the ground up in this space. But to me, what I'm so excited about is the personal impact that we can all have by getting more people motivated about climate change that is relatable to them. And so I think this presentation to me really represents that, because I have Dr. Schiller, my own mother, now actively advocating and working in this space and bringing a very, very important lens, frankly, a lens that we have not focused on in the climate change space, and that's the public health standpoint. So with that, Dr. Schiller, I'll hand it off to you and take it away.
Great. Great, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As Craig said, I am a medical oncologist, and I'm here to talk about climate change and health. So I've been a medical oncologist, a cancer doctor for a long time, and I've been very busy in my work. My jobs have included being deputy director of the Harold B. Simmons Cancer Center in Dallas and the Inova Shar Health System in Fairfax, Virginia. I've also founded the National Lung Cancer Partnership, now called the Lung Cancer Research Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on raising funds for lung cancer research. So I've been busy. So busy, in fact, that I rarely took my head out of the sand to see what was happening around me. I rarely thought about climate change, even though Craig, my son, has worked in the climate change space for the past 10 years. And I'll bet many of you can relate to this. We get so caught up with our own career and family priorities, we simply don't have the capacity to take on existential challenges like climate change. Well, at least that was my experience, until several things happened. This is my grandson, Bennett, who's currently 6, and my granddaughter, Dylan, who's currently 3. And this made me start to think, having grandchildren, about what my generation is leaving their generation and their children's generation and the generations that will be here long after we are gone. And then something else happened that made climate change go even more personal for me. Over the past 10 years, we have a cabin in the mountains of Southwest Colorado. It's beautiful, as you can see here. The mountains are beautiful, the forests are beautiful. Or at least they were, until over the past decade, due to heat and drought, the spruce have become more vulnerable to the spruce beetle, and that is devastating these forests. I was able to see this change firsthand, and experiencing the loss of the beautiful green forest really hit home. It made the topic of climate change personal, visible, and that it is really affecting me now. So over the past couple of years, as I reflected on my own career, I realized that climate change had a lot of similarities to what I experienced as a lung cancer oncologist, cancer. In fact, there were some direct parallels with the war on cancer. So cancer is a very scary word. It means many things to many people and triggers different emotions. It's caused by many things, including socially acceptable behaviors such as smoking. It's insidious, It takes a very long time to develop, and you often don't even notice it until it's late. The amount of information out there can be overwhelming, and cancer can metastasize. It can spread to different areas of the body and cause unexpected consequences elsewhere. But with time and effort, society shifted smoking from being cool to not cool. This image represents a different era, one that negatively affected our health. So as I started learning a lot more about climate change, I realized that many of the challenges we face with smoking and lung cancer, we're now facing with climate change. In particular, just like it was socially acceptable to smoke, it's more than socially acceptable to be connected to the sources of climate change, like cars and coal plants. In fact, it's almost necessary to be connected to these to be able to live in our world. And asking people to make a major change for something they can't even see, it's really hard. But then 2020 happened, and it opened our eyes so we could all see some of the effects of climate change like never before. And with so many events happening in one year that people can actually see with their own eyes, it's my hope that the entire public takes the health effects of climate change more seriously. One of the things we'll all remember from 2020 is forest fires. In Colorado, all of that dried and dead wood that the beetles loved, plus the heat and drought from climate change, sparked forest fires all over the place. This picture was from the Pine Gulch Fire in Colorado, about 100 miles from our cabin. At the time it occurred, in July of 2020, it was the largest fire in Colorado history. But since then, the Pine Gulch fires was surpassed by not just one, but by two other Colorado wildfires larger in size, which means that 2020 produced the 3 largest wildfires ever recorded in Colorado history. And further west, the same ingredients that caused wildfires in Colorado were also causing wildfires in California, which was worse. California was ravaged by fires, destroying over 4 million acres and counting, over 5 times the size of the fires in Colorado. So what is particularly terrifying is that 2020 wasn't an anomaly, but rather the worst year on top of a worsening trend. This chart shows the number of fires on the West Coast, which have been growing substantially over the past 5 years alone. And these fires have a devastating effect on their local communities. They affect everyone that lives in them. Later on, I'll talk about the health effects these type of events have on the people that live near them. But now I just wanted to make the point that pollution isn't just limited to where the fires occurred. It affected people hundreds and thousands of miles away. This photo was taken in Madison, Wisconsin, and you can see how hazy the sunset is. And Bennett and Dylan, my 2 grandchildren, they live in Madison, Wisconsin. Now, of course, wildfires were not the only disaster that happened this year. My year, like many of us, I assume, has been dominated by COVID-19. We'll talk later about its relationship to climate change, but some of the consequences of this infection, overwhelmed medical resources, lack of medical supplies and equipment, political upheaval, well, as a health professional, this pandemic really hit home. One of the unexpected consequences from the COVID epidemic is that it cleared up the air in many cities around the world as traffic in them dropped to almost nothing. But one of the many bad things about COVID-19 is that we are now able to literally see pollution returning. And I started to think, what will Bennett and Dylan's life look like in 50 years? After all, they'll be in their 50s or 60s. Will there still be beautiful forests to look at, or beaches? Will there be new diseases? Will they still be able to get good medical care? And in the next 10 years, when Bennett is 16, will Bennett even need a driver's license? Will he drive cars, or will cars drive him? Maybe some good things will also have happened, like flying cars, or the cure for cancer, or a settlement on Mars, or world peace. But I do know what definitely will happen. And that is, they will be the first generation where climate change is a personal, societal, and scientific priority for their entire lives. Okay, so what is climate change? It's a term that means so many different things these days. So I wanted to talk briefly about the science behind climate change to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, so to speak. Well, while the consequences behind climate change are very complex, the basic science is actually pretty simple. As you all know, the Earth's surface doesn't absorb all the energy we receive from the sun. In fact, about half that energy is absorbed by our atmosphere or reflected back into space. The other half reaches the Earth's surface and either gets, and then lighter surfaces, of course, like snow or light-colored roofs, reflect more of this energy, while darker materials like asphalt absorb more. Greenhouse gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide trap infrared radiation and reflect it back to Earth, thus warming the planet. So where are these greenhouse gases coming from? After all, they occur naturally, right? I mean, we breathe out carbon dioxide and cows produce methane. However, our Earth spent millions of years perfecting a balancing system of these gases where plants in our oceans consume and absorb them, that creating an equilibrium. Climate change is the result of disrupting that equilibrium through an excess of greenhouse gases emissions caused from the combustion of fossil fuels. So let's start with some of the direct effects of climate change. These are the immediate consequences of increasing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. They include rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and increasing CO2 levels. Now, how scientists measure these effects is a story for another day, but suffice it to say that polls show that most Americans understand that climate change is happening, and a majority understand that we are causing it. This is a relatively recent shift on the part of the general public, but for the scientific community, they have been raising this concern for a long time. There is a very strong consensus among climate scientists around global warming. In fact, 97% of scientists agree that it's real, that it's caused by greenhouse gases, and that human activity is causing almost all the increase. This is a normal chest X-ray. You can see the ribs here, you can see the clavicles, the shoulder blades, the spine, and the white blob in the middle, which is the heart. This is a chest X-ray with a large lung cancer. Now, if that was your chest X-ray, and 97% of the colleges you went to said you have lung cancer, would you really listen to the other 3% and assume you don't? Well, that was a story of climate change from a climate scientist perspective, but I'm not a climate scientist, I'm a medical doctor. So I see the cause of climate change from a different perspective. I see climate change causing suffering. Human health is dependent on having enough good, clean, safe food and water, clean air to breathe, shelter during times of natural disasters and weather catastrophes, access to medical care, freedom from preventable diseases, and personal safety. And I see climate change impacting all of these. So in this next section of my talk, I'm going to give an overview of all the different ways climate change is affecting and will continue to affect our health. Now, I recognize upfront that this is a lot of information, so I'm going to use this framework created by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, to help organize this talk. Health consequences of climate change include severe weather, air pollution, diseases carried by insects, increased allergies, effects on water and food supplies and quality, access to care, effects on the environment, and extreme heat. Now, fortunately, there are a growing number of healthcare professionals who not only recognize the strong climate change and health connection, but who are mobilizing to take action. not from the traditional climate change perspective, but from a health perspective. More and more of these organizations, and this is just an example of one, are being formed as the data increasingly shows a direct connection between climate change, its impacts, and the public's health. So why is the public just recognizing that climate change is a real thing now? Well, because for once we can finally experience it and see it for ourselves. I mean, this has been the worst year for fires on the West Coast in decades, possibly ever. This year, we have had more named hurricanes than ever before, so many that we ran out of names and had to use the Greek alphabet to name them. And air pollution. As I showed you, we can actually see before and after pictures of what major cities look like since motor vehicle transportation came to an almost complete halt. So, climate change has a lot of health consequences. But since we have a short amount of time, I'm only going to focus on 4. These include extreme heat and heat-related illnesses, diseases due to the air quality, diseases due to changing vectors. And what I mean by that is those are diseases where the infection is carried by bugs such as mosquitoes and ticks, and access to care. So let's start with heat. So yes, it really is happening. The Earth has been warming. I've already explained the reason temperatures are increasing, and it's due to a rapid rise in greenhouse gases through the burning of fossil fuels. You can see how CO2 levels and temperature go hand in hand. If we continue to pump out CO2 as we have been in the past, we are projected to go much, much higher, our temperature, than the planet has ever seen. Now it's true, global temperature changes have occurred without human activity. However, these have occurred either on a much longer time scale, such as tens of thousands or millions of years, and through the moving of continents and global ice ages, or through massive and extreme events like volcanoes or meteors. This is the first time that a species, humans, is added to that list, and we are changing things very, very rapidly. And why is that important? Well, a warming Earth is important for all sorts of reasons, but from a health perspective, in extreme heat, people simply can't cool off. Evaporation is slowed to the point where it cannot adequately cool off the body, which leads to heat exhaustion or heat stroke. The 10 hottest years on record have all been since 2009, and 2019 was the second hottest. September of this year was the warmest September ever recorded. And it's getting warmer. This is a graph showing how Washington, D.C., where I live, how our temperature has been changing over time. The y-axis is the average number of days at or above 90 degrees. In 1960, D.C. had over 30 days at or above 90 degrees, and look at where we are now. In 2040, 20 years from now, there are projected to be 44 days at 90 degrees or above. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the words extreme heat, I think of heat stroke. However, there are more effects people probably don't think about. Premature births, for example, or increasing aggression. And believe it or not, rising temperatures have been associated with a decline in cognitive functioning. And the people most at risk, children, the elderly, and pregnant women. And of course, people who have to work outside or live without air conditioning. Like in Qatar and Doha, where hundreds of workers died in 2012 and 2013 while working outside. Baghdad hit 125 degrees recently. Do you know what 125 degrees feels like? A reporter in Baghdad recently said that when touching a doorknob, she got blisters on her hands. Now, deaths are certainly the most important consequence of heat, but they aren't the only one. Our current power infrastructure was not designed to handle this heat. I mean, California has already seen massive rolling blackouts due to increased air conditioning use. So let's turn now to air pollution. and the health consequences of air pollution, which is one of the most pronounced and consequential aspects of climate change. Now, one of the major pollutants associated with air pollution is particulate matter, or PM. PM 2.5 stands for particles less than 2.5 microns in diameter. You can see how small that is when compared to a human hair. It comes from burning fossil fuels in factories, power plants, and motor vehicles. And it can have serious health impacts. Acute exposure exacerbates illness in people who already have lung and heart problems. Long-term effects include an increased risk for respiratory diseases such as COPD or emphysema, pneumonia, heart disease, lung cancer. And as a medical oncologist who specializes in lung cancer, that's very scary. Now, something we won't have time to talk about here, but PM has also been linked with increased allergic diseases and asthma. Air pollution was the fourth highest global mortality risk factor. It was estimated to have caused over 4.2 million deaths worldwide in 2015, including more than 88,000 in the US deaths. And yet we keep on pumping out the particulate matter. Now, of course, particulate matter doesn't just come from the burning of fossil fuels. It also comes from natural sources like smoke from fires. This is a picture of one of the California wildfires, the Bobcat Fire in the Angeles National Forest. In a nearby fire, the Mammoth Lake Ranch Road Fire, PM 2.5 measurement reached 501 micrograms per cubic meter of air on September 23rd. That is over 50 times the threshold that the World Health Organization considers safe for the average PM 2.5 reading over 1 year. And it is more than 20 times the level considered safe for a 24-hour period. And people die from this level of exposure to particulate matter. This slide depicts the estimated number of excess deaths in the elderly per million people that occurred between August 1st and September 15th, compared to the number of deaths from 2015 to 2019 in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. In Portland, for example, 200 more elderly people died in that 6-week period of time than would have been expected compared to the average number of deaths in similar 6-week periods of time in 2015 and 2019. But the sources of air pollution aren't contained to outside. I'm going to hand over this next section off to Craig, who will talk about an indoor source of pollution.
Thank you. So I'm gonna pause here and just, in a big picture here, as a green building professional, I'm really hoping this section will really hit home with all of you, particularly the architects and engineers, because what we're talking about here is the interconnection, the direct interconnection between climate change and human health. And I say that because there's a few things over the last really 5 years that have changed in this space. And personally, myself and my colleagues at Rocky Mountain Institute, when we were designing green buildings, when we were consulting on green buildings, we often talked about all electric buildings because of, we didn't want them to use fossil fuels from a climate perspective and not a health perspective. So in this section, I'm gonna draw a direct connection between those two and why it's really important. So let me first start out by saying that, in the building space, it's often referred to as indoor air quality. And even read in LEED, that is one of the categories. That's actually a wrongfully labeled phrase, because quality has a positive connotation in it. I mean, think about it, when you're reading Amazon reviews, you're looking for things that say poor quality or bad quality or not good quality. Quality as a word means positive. When we're talking about indoor air quality in a building, we're really talking about the pollution levels in a building. So this is really about indoor air pollution, and indoor air pollution coming from the burning of fossil fuels. And the reason that matters, next slide. The reason that matters is because words do matter, particularly on a societal level. So what I'm going to talk about here is methane gas. You may have heard about that or known that as natural gas. That has become the new buzzword in terms of our energy transition. Over the last 10 years, natural gas has scaled across the country, and that phrase was really created by the fossil fuel industry so that natural gas in society's eyes could be more easily accepted. And it is true that methane gas does occur naturally, but let's not forget, just because it occurs naturally doesn't mean it's healthy. I mean, uranium, asbestos, radon, these are all natural things. In the building industry, we don't call asbestos natural insulation fibers. We don't call radon natural basement air, right? We call it what it is, and that's important. So I'm going to talk about natural gas as methane gas or gas because in its composition, it is mostly methane. And there's other hydrocarbon elements in there like ethane, propane, butane, and then some concentrates like nitrogen, et cetera. And the reason this is important, next slide, is because when we use methane gas in buildings, it actually does have a polluting effect. So here's some of the connections, and I'm gonna do a quick shout out. My former colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Institute were kind enough to let me use these slides, and they've done a tremendous amount of research in this area. But it simply boils down to this. We spend a lot of time indoors. We know that indoor, we don't track our air pollution levels well. And so it's often 2 to 5, as much as 100 times worse indoor air pollution than outside. And for homes that use gas stoves or gas furnaces, anything that has gas combustion in it, those can be 50 to 400% higher levels of nitrogen oxide. Now, nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide are a direct result of combusting methane gas. When you combust fossil fuels, anything from oil, coal, or methane gas, one of the byproducts is nitrogen that combines with air to create nitrogen oxide. That then turns into nitrogen dioxide. And the reason this is really important, next slide, is because nitrogen dioxide, when that's mixed with volatile organic chemicals and energy, such as the sun, it turns into ozone, it turns into smog. So the direct result of us burning gas in homes is smog and pollution. And so California, and really this is in the last few years, has done a lot of research on this. And so one of the really eye-opening things that come out of this is just the sheer amount of nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide that come from burning gas in buildings. Now combined, that's NOx, we call it NOx, and it's really powerful. So really the studies have shown that almost half of all of the NOx in Los Angeles directly come from burning gas in buildings. Next slide. So let's just take Los Angeles as an example of a representative example of across the country. Now, I know it is not. I know in places like the Northeast, there's more gas combustion in homes. And I know in places outside of LA, there are less cars. So these proportions will change. But this research suggests that really half of our NOx pollution in cities in the country are coming from our buildings. And the reason this is really important is because it's very fixable now with electric technology. This is something we can avoid. And at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about what you as building professionals can do in this, but really want to hammer this home. Next slide. Something else that has been studied in California is the impacts of all of this pollution. And it is substantial. There is a lot of health impacts, health costs associated with gas in buildings and the pollution. And these include, in an Australia study showed, 13% of asthma is contributable to gas stoves. In California, estimated $3.5 billion of healthcare from gas-fired appliances, from all of that pollution. And nationally, we're talking, almost $100 billion annually in asthma costs. And you can break that down per person. So this is at a national level, a very substantial health issue, one that traditionally we have ignored. And so I think this is a very important lens. Next slide. And it also has, it's not just asthma and lingering, annoying, but powerful issues. It is also leading to premature deaths. Another study in California looked at all of the particulate PM2.5 that Dr. Schiller mentioned, and all of the ozone emissions that are a direct correlation to NOx from combustion sources and buildings. Gas in buildings was the #1 source of premature deaths in California. This is really, really powerful. This is something that we are had unintentionally doing, and now we need to open our eyes and intentionally avoid. Next slide. So I want to draw the connection to climate and hopefully highlight a few other really powerful climate issues here. So we know, this slide is showing kind of the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions. Now we know that just burning fuels like methane gas in buildings accounts for about 10% of the national carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And most of that is from space heating. We know that buildings, like again, particularly in the Northeast, have used that for space heating quite a bit, cooking and others nationally at a smaller scale. But we know that 10% of national emissions come from methane gas in buildings. Next slide. And the reason this is so important is really the last 10 years, we've really come to understand just how much of a impact this has had on climate change. So I want to highlight this. Natural gas does leak a small amount in your home. When you're using a cook stove, there's a small amount that does leak, particularly if you have a pilot light. And when you're cooking, that flame doesn't combust all of the gas, it combusts some. So there is some lingering natural gas that pollutes in your home. However, if we follow that gas pipeline all the way to its source, we'll see a number of other leaking events. That includes in the pipes that are within your neighborhood. Those pipes are connected and those connections aren't always tight, or over time they'll shift and that leaks. At the processing plant, at the extraction and the pumping plants, again, just through mechanical errors and imperfections, that leaks. And then finally at the wellhead itself, there is, even if you flare it, which is now is illegal because flaring releases more, even the most protected wellheads have been shown to leak. In total, and this has been a lot from Sierra Club and National Resource Defense Council and RMI, and a lot of big nonprofits have spent a lot of time studying this problem and have concluded that about 13 million tons of methane gas leak annually from our system. That is a tremendous amount. That's enough to heat 10 million homes each year, and it's equivalent for the fossil fuel industry about $2 billion in losses of product a year, just by it leaking. The reason this is so important for climate change, next slide, is because methane has 84 times the near-term 20-year greenhouse gas impact of CO2. It is much better at keeping our planet warm than carbon dioxide. So that 13 million tons of methane leakage, that is the equivalent to the total greenhouse gas emissions of Japan, or the total greenhouse gas emissions of 2 Canadas, or the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the aviation sector. And granted, it's pre or post-COVID aviation sector. This has been a tough year for flying, but this is a huge amount of greenhouse gas implications and something that has really in the last 20 years been largely ignored. We didn't know this problem until recently. And one of the things that we've been able to do as the climate community, next slide, is use technology to identify and study this. And so one of the big ways that this is becoming, as our awareness this has become an issue, is through satellites. We've literally launched satellites in the last 10 years to circle the Earth and take images and track where methane's leaked. We can literally see at a pretty granular level where methane leakage is happening, and so we can track the problem. And it has also raised our awareness to how big of a problem it is. So with that, I will pause. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Schiller, and I'll talk again at the end of what you as building professionals can do about this.
Great, thank you, Craig. Okay, we're going to turn to another new topic, diseases. And these diseases that we're going to be talking about are generally carried by insects. Now, diseases can be caused by poor water quality, but we don't have time to go over to that today. As I said, instead, we are going to be talking about diseases carried by bugs. Insects that carry diseases are called vectors, and there are many diseases caused by these vectors. But in the US, the most common vectors are mosquitoes and ticks. Now, as warming increases their range and lengthens the season, these disease-carrying insects are extending their range so that more people are being exposed for longer periods of time. So if you like insects, you are in the right place at the right time because we're going to have more of them. In fact, we already have more of them. According to the CDC, illnesses from insect vectors have tripled in the United States from between 2004 and 2016. I'm going to briefly mention 2 vector-related diseases in the United States that are rising, malaria, and Legionnaire's disease. Okay, take malaria, for example. Malaria was rarely found in the United States until recently. Now there are about 1,500 cases of malaria each year in the US. The red areas on this map are where malaria is predicted to be in 2050. The rates of malaria in the US are 5 times higher now than they were in 1990. A temperature increase of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade will increase the number of people at risk of being infected by malaria by 3 to 5%. Now, that may not sound like much, but worldwide, it's actually several hundred million people. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne disease in the US, spread by deer ticks. With the increase in temperature and longer breeding seasons, the range of the deer tick is spreading, and with that, we're seeing more cases in more places, as you can see on the map. With an increase in annual average temperature of 2 degrees centigrade, the incidence of Lyme disease in the United States is estimated to increase by about 20%. And in terms of mosquitoes, well, we're already seeing that the vector-bearing season is getting longer. In Richmond, Virginia, there are already 22 more mosquito days compared to 1989. So if you like mosquitoes, you are in the right place at the right time because we have more mosquitoes. So finally, I want to talk about access to medical care, which as a physician, I'm particularly interested and concerned about. In this section, I'm going to talk about COVID-19 for several reasons. Even though it's not directly related to climate change, I'm going to use it as an example of what could and probably will happen in the future as we have more and more insect-carried diseases and pandemics. COVID-19 illustrates how fragile our medical system is and how future pandemics and other natural disasters will affect our access to care. Now, as you guys all know, the COVID-19 virus was totally unknown before 2019. Since then, it has been responsible for over 1.5 million deaths worldwide, including more than 280,000 deaths in the United States. So it serves as an excellent example of what can happen as we have more and more pandemics. Now, one of the things that we've learned is that catastrophes such as pandemics or hurricanes or floods put a huge strain on many aspects of our medical system. These headlines were actually taken from April of this year, but they could have been taken from almost any newspaper in the United States over the past 2 weeks. Then, as now, we have lack of protective equipment. And of course, we can't forget how stressed out our medical personnel are. And that includes not just doctors and nurses, but pharmacists, therapists, technicians, morticians, the people who work in hospital kitchens, and so forth. We've also learned that pandemics can disrupt something we take for granted, supply chains. In 2018, when Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, it had a devastating effect all over the island. It was one of the worst humanitarian and infrastructure disasters in decades. But it also had a national effect on our health system. The hurricane closed a factory that was responsible for the bulk of IV bags in the continental United States. And the result was national shortages of IV fluids in many hospitals and institutions. We've also seen, thanks to COVID-19, what disruption of our infrastructure can do to our ability to get health care. I mean, was there access to medical care in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans? Or when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico? Or when the Mississippi flooded in 2019? A study by the Kaiser Family Foundation Foundry looked at medium and long-term impacts of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico, and they found a number of problems which were compounded by existing socioeconomic and health issues. And these impacts include lack of basic clean food and water, widespread pollution contamination from the hurricane, disruption of medical services and inability to access care, and issues that we don't always think about, like the effects on delayed treatment for other diseases and on mental health. And it is extremely important to make it clear that communities of color are often disproportionately affected by climate disasters and climate change in general. Environmental justice and equity must be centered in any conversation we have around climate change. And needless to say, these events have economic consequences as well. This map shows all of the natural disasters that will or already have cost the Americans over $1 billion each to fix. In fact, in 2020, there were the most billion-dollar weather and natural disaster events in history. And the catastrophic effects from these types of events aren't constrained to the country they live in. The CDC says that climate change will lead to mass migration and international conflict as environments become more and more unlivable. For example, the Syrian refugee crisis was caused by 5 million refugees leaving the country due to a war which was catalyzed by a severe drought. And needless to say, chaos and conflict will not be good for healthcare, especially when the system is already at risk. We've also learned that climate change can make other serious diseases, such as COVID-19 and cancer, worse. A recent study showed that even a small increase in long-term exposure to PM 2.5 was associated with a large increase in COVID-19 death rates. And since I'm an oncologist, I particularly have been following the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic on cancer and cancer patients. For example, in this slide, the x-axis shows the number of new cancer cases by disease. You can see breast, colon, etc., from the period of time between March 7th and April 13th. The y-axis is the number of patients. And you can see that the number of patients developing cancer is going down. A good thing, right? No, the reason it's going down is that fewer people are getting screened. Screening for breast and colon cancers were down about 90%. In addition, COVID-19 has delayed treatment for many cancer patients. And that is going to mean that we will be seeing more cancer-related deaths over the next 10 years, 10,000 more. I suspect that this type of thing will occur wherever there has been a natural disaster, whether it's wildfires, hurricanes, or pandemics. And we will see more cancer deaths due to lack of screening, inability to get to medical facilities, lack of chemotherapy or supplies, lack of hospital beds, and also when catastrophes happen, people simply neglect their long-term health care and stay at home. The last thing I want to mention is the political side. This pandemic reminds us of just how interconnected our world is. Just as mismanagement of the pandemic in one country threatens lives in another, so does mismanagement of greenhouse gases in one country affect the whole globe. Synchronized global and national action is significantly more effective than uncoordinated responses, whether between nations or within nations, and whether for ventilator procurement or for reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Even the Department of Defense has identified climate change and the lack of global coordination as an important threat. This is a report to Congress from the Department of Defense in 2015. It says, climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. And that these impacts are already occurring, and the scope and scale and intensity of these impacts are projected to increase over time. that is the Department of Defense. So I know that was a lot of information, but as I said, I thought it was important to cover the breadth of ways climate change affects the public's health. So to summarize, we talked about how increasing global temperatures increase heat stroke, premature births, and increasing mortalities in places heating up the fastest. We talked about air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels and from associated increased wildfires. Pollution that increases asthma rates, lung and heart disease, lung cancer rates, hospitalizations, and ultimately higher mortality rates. We then also talked about bugs. And seriously, who wants more mosquitoes, right? But these insects carry diseases such as Lyme disease and malaria. And I also mentioned other pesky things like that air pollution causes, like increase in allergens. And finally, I talked about access to medical care and how catastrophic events like hurricanes, floods, droughts, and other wildfires are already putting a strain on our medical system. I also used COVID-19 as an example to illustrate the direct effects and the fragility of our healthcare system. And all of these major impacts on our national these impact our national security with increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources. Well, that seems like a lot of bad news, and it is. Shortly, I'm going to hand this back to Craig to talk about some good news on what we are doing for climate change. But before I do that, I want to leave you with a final thought. I'm sure most of you remember this Bruce Willis movie where an asteroid is heading toward Earth and NASA sends Bruce Willis and his mining buddies up to the comet to blast it to bits. What if scientists told us today that an asteroid the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs was coming in 50 years? What would we do? I mean, Bennett and Dylan, my grandkids, will be in their 50s and 60s, and will probably have grandchildren by then. So this is a very real threat to the health of my family. I think what we would do would be clamoring to find the technology to blast that asteroid to bits. But what if they told us that an asteroid was coming in 30 years, when my grandchildren will be in their 30s, maybe with their own kids? It's also when scientists say we need to reach zero emissions to avoid the worst of climate change. What would we do? I think we would unite to fight it, just like we did in the war against cancer and the war against big tobacco. I certainly hope and believe we have the same national willpower to combat climate change. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Craig to talk more about some of the progress that we've made combating climate change and what you can do about it.
Thank you. And let's go back one slide, please. Let's just pause here. I know this has been an hour already. I appreciate everybody staying with us. This is a very important topic. I've seen a lot of questions come through in the chat, and we're going to get to those very shortly. I've been tracking them. So I just want to tell a couple good news stories so we can end on a positive note before we talk about what you as building professionals can do, and then I can start diving into some of these questions and we can hear more from you. Okay. So the most important good news in the fight against climate change, next slide, is represented by this very easy to understand graph. So I'm gonna try to make this a little bit easier. What this chart shows is literally over the last 10 years. This has been a huge change for against climate change, literally in the last 10 years. And that is, this shows utility cost of electricity. And up here in the beginning, that used to be in 2009, was the average cost of installing solar. That's called the levelized cost of energy. That takes into account the operational costs, installation costs, the manufacturing cost, everything. 10 years ago or 11 years ago, solar, utility scale solar was extremely expensive. And look where it is as of last year. It's at the bottom. One of the best news, what's given us hope in the last 10 years, is that the two cheapest form of electricity now are utility scale wind and solar. All of the other, as you can see in this graph, all the other fossil fuel-based generation processes for electricity have roughly stayed the same in cost. Wind and solar have done this incredible drop. And I think that is something that we need to celebrate because it is really giving us hope. All right, next slide. What that means, and I'm trying to make this really simple, on this chart on the right here, this is the ranking order of costs. On the bottom, that's good, that's the lowest cost. On the top, that's the worst cost. The percentage that you're seeing, that is the total cost reduction over the last 10 years. And as you can see, wind and solar have had the greatest cost reduction over the last 10 years. What this means is that renewables are now the cheapest form of energy generation in most parts of the world and will continue to get cheaper in the other parts of the world. This literally means that another coal power plant will not be built in the United States because it is fiduciarily irresponsible on behalf of the utility. Banks won't finance it because there are cheaper and more effective ways to generate the same thing. That is a game changer. That is will always be marked in history. This decade will be marked in the combating against climate change, that we rallied around a technology, we invested in the R&D to make it scalable and started implementing it. And that is a trend that's only going to continue. Okay, this is how we know it's happening. Next slide. This is one of my favorite headlines of the last 10 years. The Kentucky Coal Mining Museum switched to solar power in 2017. The museum in Kentucky dedicated to coal mining put solar panels on the roof, and to quote them, it's because it's going to save on energy costs. The museum itself started using solar because it was cheaper. That to me, that is a pivot moment that I will always hold dear to my heart. Next slide. 2 years later, in 2019, the Pope, the Catholic Church, said that climate change was an emergency. It threatens the very future of the human family, and it is the poor who suffer the worst impacts of the climate crisis. These are two organizations, or this is the Catholic organization is traditionally not the most progressive. So the fact that they are making this as an emergency, a national and international emergency, is phenomenal news. The next slide. This year, we had a series of announcements from the financial sector. In January, earlier this year, BlackRock, who is the largest asset holder, they're the largest investor in the world, quote, they are now going to make climate investments. The CEO, Larry Fink, sent out a letter to all of his investors and to his board saying that we are now going to be climate aligned because it is in our best interest as investors. Next slide. Just 2 months ago, in October, JP Morgan followed. They said, this is the second largest bank in the world. JP Morgan's the largest bank in the United States. They said that they are going to pledge to push their clients to align with the Paris Climate Commitment. So they are now taking internal action and advising their clients to take climate action and to have their businesses and their assets prepared for climate change, to make that clean energy transition. Next slide. As of, I think it was last week, Bank of America said that they're going to join the other 5 largest banks in the world to not fund drilling in the Arctic. We now have a movement here in which the financial industry is transitioning away from fossil fuels and going towards clean energy because it is financially responsible, because they're understanding that there is economic risk to not doing this. Everything my mother just mentioned, Dr. Schiller just mentioned, this is something that they are looking at from a financial perspective, literally things on their books. That's incredible. What I am going to, next slide, what I want to highlight here is, as Bank of America is actually one of the laggards in the financial space. They didn't do this actually for financial reasons. They did this because of the activism that told them to not do it. They said it will not, that they will not finance any oil or gas exploration in the Arctic, making it the last major financial institute to do so because of ongoing pressure from environmental groups and the indigenous communities. They are now responding to their shareholders, and the shareholders are telling them that they want to plan for a clean energy future. The reason I'm mentioning this is because this type of activism works, and I'm gonna talk about that in a second. The activism from shareholders is something we've seen tremendously over the last 5 years. It is something that, like youth activism, shareholder activism, is something that's really changed the landscape. So the good news here is not only do we have the technological ability and it used to be that we had the technological ability, we just had to convince someone to pay a premium to do the right thing. Even the first LEED buildings came at a premium, now they don't. Solar panels used to have a premium, now they're actually cheaper. Fossil fuels now have a premium. That switch has been huge. In the last few years, as I just showed, these huge institutions, arguably very conservative institutions, the Catholic Church, the Department of Defense, the largest banks, are all making commitments around climate change. That is tremendous. That's great news. That gives us all hope. Next slide. So what can you do? As I'm sure in many webinars on climate change, there are a bunch of things that you can do. In this webinar, we wanted to make it simple. I wanted to give a very clear call to action, and that is a very simple one, and that's a personal commitment to all electric buildings. You in the building space, this is the impact you can do. So my ask of you, my call to action that I think you should do is champion an all electric policy in your firm, your architecture engineering firms, engage local chapters, AIA, ASHRAE, USGBC, et cetera, and advocate for all electric policies in your city. I saw one of the questions is what can we do to do this? If you just start Googling, all electric buildings, there'll be a number of resources from NGOs like the Sierra Club, like RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, that talk about what can be done and what needs to be done. And I have no doubt that if you reach out to them, they'll talk to you about local building chapters that are already advocating this. But this is the simple ask. Next slide. And it is being done. This electrify movement has really started rapidly increasing over the last 6 months. I saw someone in the chat give a resource from New York. New York is one of the leaders in this. They have an aim to phase out gas by 2050. They've set emission standards for commercial buildings. They are the largest city in the country, and they're one of the most progressive in this. Seattle's considering it. There's several suburbs of Boston that are considering a national gas ban. San Francisco, literally within the last couple of weeks, banned methane gas. I have to correct myself. Banned methane gas in all new construction. So did Oakland as of like 3 days ago or 4 days ago. And there are 40 other cities in California considering this. And this will scale. So that's the ask, is to go all electric. And there's no simple way to do that other than convincing your clients. And I know we'll get to questions here in a second. I know that is a hard ask. I know many people have a very personal connection to gas stoves, particularly residentially. But as Dr. Schiller pointed out, we had a cultural connection to smoking and its imagery in the last few decades, and we needed to make that shift for our health, and this is no different. So with that, before we get to questions, I do have a few thank yous. A lot of my slides came to me from Brady Seals at RMI. She's an absolute rock star leading on this building natural gas health connection. The entire team at Rocky Mountain Institute, my former colleagues, are one of the many nonprofits championing this Electrify Everything movement, and they have been so incredible with their research and their advocacy. The Sierra Club, I put this in here because the Building Electrification Action Plan is one of the resources that I have used to find out what kind of policies we need in this area. So if you're looking for a clear resource, just look that up. And then finally, a shout out to all of the healthcare professionals, Dr. Schiller, my mother included, and all the health professionals that are rallying around the country to form advocacy groups to bring this attention. This is an incredible moment in bringing this new voice. 20 years ago, would you have trusted a tree hugger not to do something? No, I mean, there's a cultural, we had this ingrained disbelief or not wanting to understand or believe someone who was so passionate from an environmental perspective, but you listen to your doctor. So the fact that we're getting doctors and nurses and health professionals involved in this, I think is going to change that societally. And Joslyn, I want to thank you and GBRI for giving this important topic a voice and a megaphone. So that's my thank you. I know.
I too have many people to thank, including Joslyn and GBRI, most of all. Citizens Climate Lobby and Sea Change Conversations, which have helped with some of these slides. Of course, my family, Bennett and Dylan and Craig, who got me into this. And of course, you for attending this and giving us your time. Thank you for your attention. You want the
Okay.
screen back, Jocelyn, or you want it?
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you so much, Joan and Craig. I think it was so inspiring. You know, we got so much information, and then also we got inspired. I see a lot of action already. I love the, Craig's call to action for all of us, including, GBRI. I do see a lot of recommendations already in our chat. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually expand our page, and this page where you registered for the webinar, we're going to include all this discussion over here, because I see many people asking some questions, and also see some webinar attendees proposing solutions. So we definitely want this discussion to keep moving, because we don't want to have this webinar to be just done for today. We have to have an active, ongoing discussion where we share resources, right, so that we continue to inspire us. And I would love, I thank Craig and Joan for taking time to help us with the webinar. I really enjoyed going through this, creating the presentation with them, and I hope to have them again come back with to do more webinars with GBRI. So right now, let's do one thing. We have lots of questions on the screen. You're looking at what we have discussed as a summary. So Craig I believe Craig has access to all the questions. Craig can go through one by one while I filter them. Craig, please.
Yeah, I think I saw a couple questions in about methane gas, and let me just mention those a bit. You heard me correct myself around natural gas. I mean, I think that is it is an important thing that we all need to do, and that is to be really aware of what the term is, because that term does have a connotation for clients. I will say there is a term, renewable natural gas, that will be a growing thing in this clean energy transition, and that really refers to methane gas that is harvested from biological sources. So an example would be an anaerobic digester at a municipal sewer plant really can break up human waste and turn it into methane gas. That actually is a good word of the word natural, because it is renewable, because it's not fossil fuel based, and it is natural in that it is forming through biological processes. And so in the future, renewable natural gas is a good thing. What is not a good thing, and this is one of the reasons why new construction banning of gas is so important, is the infrastructure to build out methane gas pipelines is substantial, not just at like a cul-de-sac community level, but also nationally. And what happens is if we spend millions or billions of dollars building that pipeline out, that's what we call a sunk asset, meaning it is going to be there forever. And anytime in the future we look at fuel switching, we're not correctly accounting for the cost of fuel switching, because this billion-dollar thing is already there. So that's really important. So yeah, that is just very important. Another thing is you will hear like renewable natural gas buses, et cetera, or just natural gas buses from methane gas. Again, research has shown that yes, that was a good idea in principle, but the leaking even at the bus level from the combustion is so much that it is actually, I don't remember the exact amount, but it is worse than a diesel bus running in terms of its emissions. So I'll mention those. I saw a chat here also on the touchy subjects, maybe having another webinar in the future, Jocelyn, with a appliance manufacturer. There is no doubt that people love their gas fireplaces and they love their gas stoves. That is, I have several colleagues who are like gloating legal experts on the energy transitions. I won't name them, but who have a gas stove because they're avid cooks and they won't switch. That's an issue. We have a personal connection to it. I understand that is personal. I think one of your jobs moving forward, I hope, is to really educate your clients about the full impact of that. You know, it's not just an appliance, but it also has this impact on your health. And hey, we can install this for you, but we're gonna, literally cost out the right ventilation system to get rid of this pollutant in your home. I think when people start hearing the implications, they may change their mind. The electric cook stoves, the induction cook stoves now, the technology is actually cost competitive from a cooking perspective, and takes a little bit of learning curve, but it's there. So I saw some of those chats. Another chat, Lacey, you had a great question about, green building rating systems and ASHRAE and how they could be updated. No surprise here, but ASHRAE is a very large organization that is very building industry accountable. That makes it a very, it is not a progressive one in terms of its policies. How do you change them? Great question. I really believe it's going to take a number of NGOs, things like USGBC, the New Building Institute, RMI, and practitioners from design build firms to just talk out to local chapters and say, we want this code changed. You know, it's important for the communities, it's important for us. Cities are already requiring it, cities in California. And if you want to be competitive in California, I mean, and by the way, this is what we saw in the auto industry. California set higher air quality standards and mileage standards for our vehicles. The auto industry responded. Recently, Trump tried to roll those vehicle standards back, and the auto industry said, no, this is the trend. We want to sell vehicles in California, we're going to keep it. As soon as these cities like New York and San Francisco set these all electric standards, national design firms are going to have to know how to do that, and it'll actually just be easier for that to just be the default and norm. That's a message I think you need to send to ASHRAE. Let's see. Oh yeah, any thoughts on induction cook stove? Yes, the induction cook stovetops are trending down. I actually think they're cost competitive with medium range gas stoves. Those prices change every 6 months. I have used, I don't have one now, but I have used and had owned induction cook stoves, and they're great. They're fantastic, and yes, they will be cost competitive. Oh, Valerie, you asked a question here, and something from New York. Yes, New York is a tremendous resource. I saw Valerie put her email in here for recommendations. So please, in the Q&A, thank you, Valerie, for that. Let me go back to the chats here. Do we have? Is there a study?
Valerie had another question.
Oh yeah, Valerie, can you?
Yeah, so she had another question on passive house standards.
Oh yeah, I chatted that answer. I haven't looked at passive house standards in a couple of years. The building I worked on, the Innovation Center, that was passive house, so I'll acknowledge my information is a few years old. But passive house was, I think still is, a performance-based standard where they set requirements on the amount of energy used per square foot of a building, as well as the amount of air infiltration in that building. It's a performance-based standard to say you need a very energy efficient and very tight enveloped home or commercial building. I don't think they set criteria on the fuel source of that building. I think they should. I think this research, the amount of climate effect of methane gas and the health impacts, I think these progressive building standards should require that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes,
and
Darrow, yes, passive house is important. I absolutely agree. It is a very progressive and very important design standard to say we can build buildings better, to use less energy and make them tighter, etc. Just want to double add, for the third time now, when you make a building tight, the air usually has less circulation. That's part of the reason, or you have to transfer the heat. When you vent, the less pollution in the building, the better.
So this question may be for Dr. Schiller.
Yeah.
There is one that Ashley asked about public health. Gosh, there's so many questions coming in, I'm unable to actually keep up. Is there an easy way to connect these topics more directly to public health when communicating with clients?
As I think Craig said earlier on, we have been so used to looking at this subject through the lens of climate scientists. I think the more we actually talk about health, it will finally, I think that will be an extra nudge to finally move things along, I think. I think if people hear that, why should I buy an electric stove? Well, it's because the natural gas stoves are so bad for your health, it will change. So I think it takes everybody speaking the same talk.
Got it. Thanks, Joan.
There's Jasmine, do you have another one, or there's a few more chat or from previous chats that I'll mention, but is there another question?
Please go ahead. I think there's one that I saw on the energy modeling thing, which you answered. I feel, the energy modeling guidelines that USGBC also puts forward is actually based on cost. And I do see the point where building designers, they would actually go with gas systems because gas costs less when you do the energy modeling. So you get more lead points when you actually show that. So that has to be changed even from a USGBC point of view, where when you have energy modeling guidelines to propose new, either if they cannot actually go with the USGBC standard, have the project propose a new language that they could actually supersede, something like that. But I feel we have all these questions. One option is, I don't think we may have time to go through everything, Craig. Because I feel like Felicia may have a couple of things to talk about our next webinar. What I am hoping is I'm going to actually ask our web developer to open a discussion board underneath this course, just like we spoke about earlier, Craig. I think we are going to put all these questions there with the names, and then if we will try to answer them, and Craig, I also invite you to come and answer them next couple of days. And then let's I've also included your LinkedIn profile here. I know that many of you actually asked for the slides, so we are going to give you a copy of the PDF. Dr. Joan is going to, Dr. Schiller is going to actually do more presentations in the future. So we will include her information also in the thank you email, along with Craig's and our LinkedIn profile pages. That way you can connect with us. And Craig, do you want to take one more question, and then I think I'll pass it on to Felicia.
Yeah, I think I can do this in 60 seconds. Some of the questions were on net zero energy, distributed energy, the importance of trees. In my opinion, and so as a advocate, as a researcher, as a practitioner in this, I'm not a day-to-day practitioner in the way that you are, so I have a different step back lens. To me, absolutely, net zero energy. If you can design a net zero energy or net zero energy building, that should be the start, because that requires you to be very practical and intentional with how much energy that building can use. When you add renewable energy to that building or to a community, one of the most important things that it does is reduce not only the emissions, but the energy loss. There's a comment in here about the loss from utility scale generation. Your solar panels on your roof have a much smaller loss than the national utility scale. So if you start by net zero energy ready, by the way, Passive House is a means to get to a net zero energy building. If you start there, you add renewable energy or use community-based solar or something else of that type, if you can't do it all on your roof, that is ideal. Taking out the methane gas appliances in the building entirely and just being entirely fossil fuel free is essential. The one piece I'll just add on top of that, here is, of course, biodiversity and wildlife. Obviously, indoor plants, obviously replanting trees on properties, etc., and in our communities are essential. That has so many different benefits for a different topic here, but that is net zero energy with trees is the way of the future. We just need to make taking out methane gas as one of those bullet points, because it hasn't been so far. All right.
Thanks, Greg. Felicia, the floor is all yours now.
All right, thank you, Jeslyn. Before we go, I'd like to share details about our next webinar. Mindfulness and meditation have become buzzwords these days with good reason. It can transform not just your life, but the world around you too. Sustaining our beautiful planet and caring for fellow humans comes natural to a mindful individual. A study by Massachusetts General Hospital found that as little as 8 weeks of meditation not only helped people feel calmer, but also produced changes in various areas of the brain, including growth in areas associated with memory, empathy, sense of self, and stress regulation. Join us for a 1-hour webinar where our very own Jeslyn Vargas explores the topic of mindfulness and meditation and how it interconnects with sustainability, including the well-building system. Jeslyn will conclude the session with a 20-minute guided meditation that you can customize and make yours. We have a suggested pricing for this webinar of $19.99. If you are facing hardship, we do have a 50% and 100% off coupon available. We encourage you to use the honor system. Please only use the discount codes if you truly need it, as we only have 250 seats available for each coupon code. I am including the link to this webinar in the chat. There will also be a link that is sent in the follow-up email for today's webinar. And that will conclude today's webinar. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you have any questions or you need to get in touch with us, you can email us at info@gbrionline.org or call us at 210-858-7783. Or we also have a chat on our website. And we also have, on behalf of everyone here at GBRI, I would like to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Felicia, and thank you again, Craig and Dr. Schiller for this wonderful presentation. I loved it. I love the passion, and I also see the excitement among the crowd. So I definitely, I promise that we will actually have another webinar where we will invite some appliance manufacturers. We'll have some intense conversation on gas.
Yeah, and the cost of them too, the cost of appliance switching.
Yes.
Yeah, Jocelyn, thank you and Felicia for this opportunity and this great voice to the building community.
Absolutely. Looking forward to more.
Bye now.
Bye.